Good evening, everyone. Good evening. How are you all doing? Give me a sound check really quick in the chat. Thanks for all of you who are coming out with me this evening. This is another episode of The Left Lens, another live stream. You know what to do. Make sure that you like this stream. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you are new here and have not yet subscribed. Make sure you hit that notifications bell because YouTube doesn't like to notify you all when I go live, when I have video coming out, when a clip is coming out. So make sure you hit that notifications bell as well. And be sure this is independent media. This is anti-empire media, anti-imperialist media. You all know me. I am on the left, but that doesn't mean liberal. That doesn't mean Democrat. That means truly left, all about real unity of those who are downtrodden. So do support this work. You can do that. Patreon.com/Dhaiphong. About $50 per month from a goal that I have not yet been able to reach over the last year. So it would really be appreciated. You can do yearly memberships now. Actually, I just found that out if you go onto one of my tiers. So, it can be, you can save money doing that. So please do support this independent media work by subscribing on Patreon. You can become a YouTube channel member. I don't see anyone else here who's a channel member, but do shout yourself out because your support is very much appreciated. There's also Substack in the link in the description. You can go to the description and find so many places to support me. But without further ado, good evening, everyone. It's a later stream on this Saturday evening for me, but I have a host of things I wanted to speak to you about. It will be a fun one. I guess as fun as could be expected given the situation that we are in. So, yeah, how's everyone doing tonight? How's everyone doing tonight or this morning or wherever you are? I know I have a lot of international, or I should just say global viewers, people outside of the United States. There's not many people talking about empire, talking about U.S. foreign policy, the collective West's imperialist policy out in the United States. Not many people doing that. So, I'm glad to be one of the few, but I hope that more and more people can join in on this work. So without further ado, I'm going to let you know first a rundown of what I hope to cover. So first, I'm going to react to this absolutely heinous resolution that the European Union Parliament just pushed through. It's more of a symbolic gesture, but it is significant nonetheless. Part of this propaganda war, part of this McCarthyism, but really what it is, and I'm going to demonstrate why this just shows how the EU is unraveling. It's unraveling as we speak politically, economically, and even as the EU complains about how the US is profiting off its demise, it's still doing things like this, going after Russia, which was once the EU's principal supplier of energy, now not so much, and the economic crisis is coming. So I'm going to react to that first. Then I have Alexander Mercouris. I have a video from him I wanted to play, just the first few minutes as he goes over Ukraine's energy crisis. I think he does a good job summing it up. You all probably know, or maybe some of you don't know, that Russia has escalated its its missile strike campaign. I shouldn't say just airstrikes because it's not just airstrikes per se necessarily, but it has been launching missiles at Kiev's energy infrastructure. And I saw someone early in the chat saying they're concerned about the humanitarian situation, and surely it's about to get really grave. Alexander Mercouris is going to summarize that. And Vladimir Zelensky, what the Duran folks the good folks over there call Zelensky, his wife just made a really cringe comment. I will go over that around this energy crisis. And then without further ado, the last topic of the evening will be one dear to my heart. It is the fact that Cuba's top leadership, President Miguel Diaz-Canel, as well as his top administration, have been traveling. They've gone to Algeria, Turkey, and now Russia and China. And I'm going to go over the Russia and China visits in particular and why this just demonstrates how the multipolar world is strengthening, and you have socialist countries like Cuba and China in the lead, and Russia playing an incredibly useful, helpful, and very progressive role in ensuring that Cuba, terrorized by U.S. sanctions and U.S. interference, remains independent and is able to continue to do all the good things that Cuba does, both at home and abroad. So that is what I am going to go over tonight. All right. So it's going to be a great show. So keep sticking around. Be sure to like the video. Be sure to hit that subscription button if you're new to the channel and have not yet subscribed. And be sure to hit the notifications bell, because YouTube sometimes likes to suppress things, likes to suppress content, doesn't like to push out what we do here at the Left Lens. So you want to make sure that you are helping out as best you can, and I very much appreciate it. And of course, be sure to support this work monetarily if you are able, because that's how I keep the work going. You can do so. All the links are in the description. Patreon, YouTube, Substack, you name it. There's a lot of different options, but those are the best three. All right. Let's get started. How about that? Let's get started, because I have a lot to cover in about 90 minutes. Then I like to chill a little bit with all of you. So keep liking the video. Let's see where we're at in terms of likes. Let's see where we are at. We have about 500 viewers and 330 likes. Let's try to get up to 400 likes in the next few minutes as I get started here, all right? It's really good to be with all of you this evening. This channel is growing. It's very exciting. I really appreciate all of you who have come. Oh, so I have a question about China and the protest. This is very interesting. Thank you for that super chat. I'm actually going to note that. If you want to leave super chat questions, I'm going to try to answer them after I'm done with the content. But Max Stalin, great name. What's up with the protests in China? Why isn't the Communist Party stepped in to protect the workers at Foxconn? That's an ever-moving development. I'm very interested in seeing what is instigating that. I know a little bit. I've been reading up a bit, both from Western media and Chinese media. It's complicated. It definitely has somewhat to do with local administration. Definitely has something to do with Foxconn, which has a reputation in China. When I was there, Foxconn didn't have the best reputation. It was known as a very exploitative place to work. It's a Taiwan-based company that, of course, does a lot of business in China. Workers like to work for Foxconn because they can work a lot of hours and they can make actually wages that are even more competitive than some other industries in China. So it's a very complicated situation. Then you also have a lot of these NED-backed labor organizations that get involved. It's unclear if they're involved in this, but it is very clear that there are some real problems. So I'm going to get into that maybe at the end, because a lot of people have been asking me. It's a very fluid situation. Not a lot is known. There is unrest, though, around this particular situation, and the government is very concerned, and we'll see how it all plays out. All right, let's do this. First up. So the European Union decided it was a good idea. This just happened a few days ago around the Thanksgiving holiday out here in the United States. The European Union has voted upon a resolution, that names Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Yeah, that's right. The European Union has done this. And so, first off, the level of hypocrisy here is ridiculous. And this is in response to Russia's missile strike campaign, to Russia's escalations. This is no longer a special military operation that Russia is fighting. It is now a counterterrorism operation. And why is Russia fighting it like a counterterrorism operation? Well, one, the special military operation winded down after the referendums were held in the Donbass, but also the character of this war has changed with the destruction, the terrorist attack on Nord Stream, the Black Sea Fleet, right, and the Crimea Bridge. just so many after so many, and then this Poland missile incident, right? Not even to get into that. All of this, right? All of this shows that Ukraine's government is acting as a regime of terrorism. It's a terrorist regime. It is backed by the collective West, by the EU, and that's how it is behaving. So Russia is fighting this conflict now as a counter-terrorism operation. And so how did the EU react? Because Russia's missiles have absolutely obliterated Ukraine's energy sector. Absolutely obliterated it. It's likely not to be functioning for much longer, but it's about half capacity, and we'll get into that with Alexander Mercouris's video. But this was a response. This was a real public relations campaign response, a very contradictory one, which I will show. But basically, what the EU is saying is that Russia's so-called unjustifiable, unprovoked invasion, that's how they frame it, is worthy of Russia getting this terrorism label. Now, this is really rich from the European Union in so many respects, okay? And in one of respects, we have to understand what the European Union has done, especially since many of its members, especially its leading members, are NATO members as well. So what has the European Union done? And that just shows how hypocritical this label is. Well, to begin, the European Union, its leading members are vassals of the United States. We know this because of how they've acted in this Ukraine crisis, how they've handled it, how they've instigated it, and then how they've responded to it. But it's deeper than that. The European Union itself is a state sponsor of terrorism. And this is well proven in the case of just one country. Just look at Syria, which there's now increased escalations there because of Turkey's military operation against the Kurds, and the U.S. building a new base there, and CENTCOM are really worried about its operations there being interrupted, not just by Turkey, but also by the vulnerabilities that have been placed on it by Turkey's operation, which could leave it vulnerable to Syria, which Syria never gave permission for the United States to be there and occupy 1/3 of its territory. But all throughout, the United States has had the European Union support back when the UK was part of the EU, but also among all of the participating countries has had all of their support in funding, in arming actual terrorists, Al-Qaeda affiliates, and the like to destroy Syria. So that's just one case, right, where the EU has actually supported the arming of actual terrorists, especially with its special relationships with the Gulf countries and with Israel, which have been key players in that proxy war. But then the EU was also a leading champion of the war in Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Other than France's tepid comments at that time, which, to be honest, didn't go that far, and there really wasn't much opposition from France throughout the duration of that invasion, but most of the EU was also on board with the invasion of Iraq. Most of it was. And not only that, they didn't do anything to stop the invasion of Iraq, which then created the conditions, the fertile conditions for terrorism to explode in the region, not to mention the destruction of entire society, millions of people killed and or displaced. I mean, we can go on and on and on, but the hypocrisy of the EU calling Russia a state sponsor of terrorism really knows no bounds. And so it's important to first just understand this as a shameless public relations move, an absolutely shameless public relations maneuver. That's not going to work. First and foremost, there's a lot of problems that the EU faces right now. But I want to just pull up what Al Jazeera was saying about it, because Al Jazeera, I would consider mainstream media. It's not adversarial. I wouldn't really call Al Jazeera, it's Qatar based, but Al Jazeera has basically supported the U.S. imperial line, the collective West line, and basically everything, especially the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But I just want to go over what they're saying about it, because I think there's a lot to react to quickly. I'm not going to go too far, but here you already have it. European Parliament's move is largely symbolic and unlikely to be applied to other aggressor nations, such as Syria. So here you already have this tacit agreement with the EU's policy. This is how most mainstream media reads. The EU passing through this resolution, which is absolutely stupid in a lot of ways, but very counterproductive to escalate and instigate with Russia now that winter is coming and that Ukraine looks even more and more vulnerable. But nonetheless, here you have this Al Jazeera mainstream media outlet calling Syria an aggressor, which, surprise, surprise, Qatar has supported the proxy war in Syria since the beginning. But the European Union has EU Parliament has declared Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, saying Russian atrocities against Ukrainians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure violate international humanitarian laws. So, by this logic, the EU is a state sponsor of terrorism. The EU has destroyed infrastructure. It has done that through its weaponization, its militarization of the proxy war in Syria, of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. The EU is very guilty of these crimes to a much larger degree. But of course, Ukraine is European, supposedly. It's by the way, it's not, and it will never be an EU member. However, Ukraine, in the propagandistic terms, is European. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Oh, those Arabs and Muslims and people who are indigenous to that region, brown skin folk, they aren't so much worthy of the same kind of treatment and the same reaction from the EU, right? The EU is not going to condemn itself for committing war crimes and actually sponsoring terrorism abroad. So the parliament's move on Wednesday was welcomed by Ukrainian officials who have been pushing the EU and NATO countries to label Russia a terrorist state. And then here you have Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, saying Russia is a terrorist state, confirmed by the EU. Russia has a history of acts of terror, blah, 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 against sovereign states, support for terrorist regimes, blah, blah, blah. This is all just scratching the back of a puppet regime that really is out of control. The EU has no centralized list of state sponsors of terrorism and no equivalent mechanism, so there will not be any immediate legal consequences. So this is what also is really, I think, just so counterproductive about this, is that it doesn't make a damn difference. The EU can't do anything to Russia based on this. This isn't going to go through the United Nations Security Council, which Russia's a member, so nothing is going to pass through there. There's not going to be some kind of roll call or resolution pushed through the UN. This is all just an exercise in public relations. So while the declaration mainly focused on Russia's actions in Ukraine, the parliament also called on EU leaders to include the Russian paramilitary organization Wagner Group of mercenary fighters known for some awful atrocities in Syria. Okay, so this is what's amazing, is Wagner Group is a private contractor in Russia. It did help out Syria with Syria's permission during the proxy war starting in 2015. But where is the same outrage for defense contractors of the United States? How about academia or these huge private contractors known for atrocities in Iraq? They don't get this same kind of treatment. So the list was established by the bloc in 2001 as a counterterrorism initiative. Blah 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 blah. So far, the EU has declared 13 individuals and 21 groups and entities, including ISIL and Al-Qaeda, as terrorists and slapped sanctions on them. So Russia is now on this list as state sponsor of terrorism. Anyway, to move on, this doesn't say too much. This is how Russia reacted. Maria Zakharova said, I propose designating the European Parliament a sponsor of idiocy. Touche. Hours after the declaration, Moscow launched a string of missiles across Ukraine, a sequence of events not lost on Ukrainian ministerial advisor Atan Gerashenko, who tweeted rockets hit Kiev after European Union Parliament recognized Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. So look, this is war. Okay, so this is war. Okay, Slava Ukraini. There's a response from Parliament's president, Robert Osol. So fascist hashtags, Slava Ukraini is a fascist hashtag. Oh, I forgot Libya. I didn't even mention Libya. Thank you so much in the chat. So Literally, the EU's support of the U.S. NATO invasion of Libya created slave markets and was principally fought by actual Al Qaeda affiliates. Just look up the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. It was an Al Qaeda affiliate which helped tear apart Libya with the cover of US and NATO and EU countries giving tens of thousands of sorties, launching them at Libyan infrastructure. How is that not being a state sponsor of terrorism? So I just want to go over that really quick because that's just a quick report. Because we will get into the divides, because there are some divides on this. There were about 40, 50 who disagreed, a few more who abstained, but it was overwhelmingly voted for because the EU is a vassal of the United States. But I wanted to play because this issue, right? This issue is coming amid, if we think about how stupid this really is, it comes as the EU is facing a huge economic crisis and energy crisis. It's already experiencing it. Pepe Escobar, who's on the stream, told me, he's in Paris. He's like, just watch. If you came here and saw the prices of things, you would be absolutely shocked. He doesn't know how people are getting by. He knows it's going to absolutely destroy the energy sector, right, in France. That they're in terms of plants, energy plants, they're running on something like a third of them, and it's rapidly deteriorating. So not only has the EU helped make Russia one of the most sanctioned country in the world at its own detriment for the United States to fight the US's proxy war on Russia. Not only that, on behalf of Ukraine, supposedly, but really it's to fight the US's proxy war on Russia. Right? So all of this kneeling to the United States has come at a huge cost. But that cost is now being felt as the EU decides to escalate with Russia diplomatically, because this is a huge diplomatic move. This is telling Russia, we are not going to ever work with you. You have no hope in us cooperating with you. And that hurts the EU more than it does Russia. It really does. It hurts the EU more than it does Russia, as much as Russia would love to have direct links because it's going backdoor through a lot of countries with its energy, but it would love to have direct links to the EU. It would. Before all of this happened, that was the goal. I mean, Nord Stream, Russia didn't try to coax Germany into building that. Germany was begging for it, but Russia was not going to complain about having easy access to the European market. That's for sure. But nonetheless, this is happening all as the EU is getting sick of what the United States is doing. So the European Union is basically on both sides doing what I think is just so indicative of how the collective West is rotting, because the EU is not only insulting Russia, telling Russia that this war against it, this economic war, this war of attrition, all of that is not going to end anytime soon, that they're not going to just be rational and begin to slow down on its counterproductive policy against Russia, but it's also getting angry at the United States. So Politico has a really interesting report, and I'm going to read some of this report. Politico is saying now that Europe accuses the U.S. of profiting from war. And so there's a lot of European Union officials who are not happy with the United States. So as they're calling Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, they're also unhappy with the United States. Well, of course they should be unhappy with the United States. And I'm going to tell you why, because there are many reasons for this, but one of which is the sky-high gas prices and the weapons sales and all the trade issues that have come about. And this is, of course, Politico, very anti-Russia, saying Putin's war threatens to destroy Western unity. Remember when we heard February, March, April, all the way into the summertime, what was Biden saying? NATO has never been more united. Europe and the United States have never been more united against Russia, against this threat for Ukraine and for democracy. Well, that was very short-lived, if it ever really existed, which I would say it never really existed. So 9 months after the Ukraine conflict began, Vladimir Putin is beginning to fracture the West. So this is how Politico puts it. That is Putin. Putin. It's the problem, despite the fact that the U.S. is the hegemon of the world, literally rendering the EU nothing but a vassal and putting its thumb on its neck and pressing really, really hard. Nonetheless, it's just Putin's fault, right? So top European officials are furious with the Biden administration and now accuse the Americans of making a fortune from the war as the EU suffers. And then so one senior official told Politico, the fact is, if you look at it soberly, the country most profiting from this war is the US because they are selling more gas and at higher prices and because they are selling more weapons. Oh, well, no shit. No way. I can't believe it. I can't believe that after what? 9 months now, after 3/4 of a year since February 24th, even before that, those subsidies were coming into the war machine. And now you're complaining after supporting the Biden administration, everything he did. It's just incredible. So the explosive comments backed by in public and private by officials, diplomats, and ministers everywhere follow mounting anger in Europe over American subsidies that threaten to wreck European industry. The Kremlin is like, Russia is likely to welcome the poisoning of the atmosphere among Western allies. A senior EU official said that we are really at a historic juncture, arguing that the double hit of trade disruption from U.S. subsidies and high energy price risks turning public opinion against both the war effort and the transatlantic alliance. America needs to realize that public opinion is shifting in many EU countries. Oh, well, also, no way. That couldn't be true. It couldn't be that people are angry that inflation has skyrocketed, that they won't be able to afford to heat their homes, that they can't afford food, that whatever savings they had are dwindling, their wages are decreasing. No way. They couldn't be angry about that, that there's going to be massive factory closings and industrial closings, deindustrialization. Why would people be angry about that? And so what's interesting about this is what they're referencing, because I'm not going to read this whole article. They're referencing not only that the United States is selling gas at 4 times the price of what Russia was selling it to the EU for, but they're also complaining about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a lot of these corporate subsidies for the U.S. corporations. It is a lot of tax subsidies, which are going to woo European industries out of Europe. It's going to artificially deflate economic conditions for the U.S., making it more attractive. And it's going to pull industries away, and it's already doing so in helping facilitate the deindustrialization. So it's not just that the sanctions alone against Russia are going to do this because they're a big factor in it, but it's also because the U.S. itself is doing it to the detriment of Europe. And the EU, up until this point, has been mostly silent, and a lot of these officials are anonymous, but Josep Borrell, who he's the jungle guy, right? He says Americans, our friends, take decisions which have an economic impact on us. He said the U.S. has rejected these complaints. One National Security Council spokesperson said, the rising gas prices in Europe is caused by Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Putin's energy war against Europe, period. So if you say Putin enough, the United States believes you can convince anyone that it's not their fault, right? That it's not the U.S.'s fault, even though this is the U.S.'s fault 100%. And it's also the EU's fault for just China says it all the time. Russia says it all the time. The EU made its bed by basically giving up its entire strategic independence from the U.S., giving that up, tanking its own currency, and basically imploding itself. But exposing one thing that I've said on this channel many times, the EU was never a powerful force. It was always a junior partner of the American empire. That's what we're learning very, very, very starkly in this moment. So the biggest point of tension in recent weeks has been Biden's green subsidies and taxes that Brussels say unfairly tilt trade away from the EU and threaten to destroy European industries. Despite formal objections from Europe, Washington has so far shown no sign of backing down. At the same time, the disruption caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is tipping European economies into recession, with inflation rocketing and devastating squeeze on energy supplies, threatening blackouts and rationing this winter. As they attempt to reduce their reliance on Russian energy, EU countries are turning to gas from the U.S. instead, but the price Europeans pay is almost 4 times as high as the same fuel costs in America. Then there's the likely surge in orders for American-made military kit as European armies run short after sending weapons to Ukraine. So you have now, Macron, you have a lot of these European Union officials even publicly saying that this is a problem. I'm not going to go more into this because that's really the deal with that. That's really the deal with what the EU is complaining about now. So the EU is angry that they have to pay so much more for natural gas. That was inevitable, though. Anyone who knows anything about economics, knows anything about capitalism, anything at all, you know that when you raise the costs of distribution, right, which, I mean, think about it. You have to get that gas across the Atlantic now. There was really no basis for that to work for the EU at any kind of good price. And you know that the US energy monopolies, they're notorious for this. They're notorious for selling their gas, their energy at prices well above anyone else. Because guess what? Dollar hegemony, the petrodollar, they can kind of do what they want, and they have all the leverage here. The EU has no leverage. The EU is coming like Oliver Twist with its hand out, being like, please help me, sir. I'm hungry, right? So what are these gas companies going to do? You're hungry? Well, you got to feed us before we feed you, and that's what's been happening, right? So Daddy America is a very abusive father. It's a relationship that is meant to basically impose the American model on Europe, right? Turn Europe's economy into austerity central, right? The central place for austerity. This has been a process in the making even before this, but now the US and its monopolies is saying, well, it's time to go for the gusto. It's time to complete this process. And so, yes, Europe is mad. Europe should be mad. European officials should be angry, but they have a lot to blame. They have really themselves to blame. And now think about this. They were receiving 40% of their energy supply before all of these sanctions on Russia from the Russian Federation. Now, not only are they pissed off at the United States, but they're going around calling Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, which in my opinion is unfounded because what Russia is doing has a very strategic goal. It is fundamentally different from how wars are fought by the US and the EU and for much different purposes. But nonetheless, regardless of whether you agree or you disagree with their critiques of Russia, them calling Russia a state sponsor of terrorism is just fueling the flames of a relationship that is essentially over for the foreseeable future. Unless the EU now, I mean, Russia is not to be bullied, right? Russia is not going to be bullied by the collective West. It has shown that it won't be bullied. It can get on without it, even if there is some struggle temporarily. But Russia's economy is set during what will likely be a depression for the EU and likely the United States. Americans, I'm right here in the US. I know this to be true. Don't think that you are immune to this. This affects you deeply. There will be a recession in the United States. There will be. And a lot of the top economists, these Wall Street lackeys, they're even saying that this recession, that this economic crisis is going to be deeper, longer, more painful, and fundamentally different in terms of its impact on the entire global economy than even prior events because of the centrality of geopolitics, because of how energy is playing a central role in this. There's a lot of reasons, but those being the big ones that this is going to be very, very painful. And so the EU has a lot of itself. Basically, the EU is really to blame for this to a large degree, but yet they are going after the country that they've made the most sanctioned country in the world and one that was basically helping the European Union's industry go. It was basically fueling it. Now Russia is saying we're going to achieve our objectives in Ukraine. You can call us what you want. Doesn't matter. We're going to keep going with this. We are going to do everything we can to achieve what we wanted from the very beginning here: demilitarization, de-Nazification, right? Uh, Russia's going to keep going. They've got hundreds of thousands of troops waiting to join the front lines this coming month. And the EU has its propaganda against Russia, but it also has a lot of problems and a lot of divides, coming with its handout to the United States, getting abused, trying to go to China to get some relief, in China saying, well, you can trade with us, but you better reconsider your policies against Russia, because it ain't helping you and it's not helping the world, right? You have this dynamic where the European Union is fracturing, becoming more divided, it's becoming weaker. And all in all, we can expect that this situation will get worse. And no amount of propagandizing, spreading anti-Russia vitriol, calling it a state sponsor of terrorism when you literally are one of the driving forces of terrorism in the world, the European Union, literally one of the driving forces, the main driving force, is a lackey of the United States, of militarism around the world, have committed unspeakable war crimes, participated in torture, destabilized entire regions. You have the nerve to call Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. The EU is going to get what it has asked for, and it's going to hurt a lot of ordinary people. That's why I don't bask. But ultimately, this is the reality of the situation, and no amount of insulting Russia is going to help the European Union, which is in for a very, very, very difficult winter season, which is just around the corner now. With that said, everyone, I'm going to move on to the next topic because it's very related. So, Ukraine's not in the EU, but that doesn't mean Ukraine isn't going through its own kind of energy crisis. And what I mean by that is, hold on, there was a little bit of a. So, all right, sorry about that. So, yeah, Ukraine is not in the EU. It surely wants to be. It will never be. But it's going through its own energy crisis, okay? And the reason for that is, well, one, Ukraine's economy has been essentially sold to Wall Street, right? You've had massive privatization, the destruction of collective bargaining, anti-union campaigns. You've had the empowerment of literal fascists, of far-right groups in the military. You've had the militarization of the economy, martial law. You've basically had Ukraine, right? You had Zelensky at the Wall Street Stock Exchange basically saying, the New York Stock Exchange basically saying, we're up for sale. And that's essentially what's happened, is that the Ukraine has undergone shock therapy, not so unlike what Russia went through in the fall of the Soviet Union, when suddenly so much of Russia's capital ended up in European banks, especially London's. But nonetheless, there is an energy crisis in Ukraine, and it's escalated mightily in the last several days because Russia is stepping up its military campaign, and it is firing missiles to a degree that is obliterating Ukraine's energy sector. And the reasons Russia is doing this are quite clear, right? It's to pressure Kiev, it's to pressure the military to stand down, to stop what it's doing. Because if you don't have power, you can't really wage a military campaign. And also, the cost on society will maybe bring pressure to end their aggression. Now, whether that will happen or not, who knows? I don't know what the future portends, but I do want to play you what Alexander Mercouris had to say on the Duran, on his own channel, actually, about this, because he goes over the scope of this. All right. And I think it's important, and I'll play it for all of you. I find his reports to be some of the best, if not the best, on updates. So let me pull that up. Make sure you're smashing the like button on this video to keep the likes coming, to keep the viewers coming. We have 634 likes, 934 watching. let's try to get to 700 likes as we watch this video. All right, everyone. So here we go. This is Alexander Mercouris as he talks about Russia's missile strikes devastating Ukraine energy.
Even whilst my program was underway. And I said in that program that it did look like it was another big attack. And so it has turned out. Some reports say that something like 70 cruise missiles, Calibra cruise missiles, presumably launched from the Black Sea, KH-101 cruise missiles launched by the Russian Air Force, no doubt land-based cruise missiles launched by Iskander missiles. Anyway, there are reports that up to 70 missiles were involved in this strike. Now, as is always and invariably the case, the Ukrainians claim that they shot most of these missiles down. The devastation that this missile strike caused across Ukraine, I have to say, tells a completely different story. But before I talk about that, I should say that there's also now some evidence that the first use, or at least the first recorded use that I'm aware of some of the new American surface-to-air missiles that have been provided to Ukraine. The first recorded use of these missiles also took place yesterday. And as far as I can see, they proved no more effective than the missiles that Ukraine already has. And there's already some evidence that one residential building was damaged in Ukraine by one of these American-provided missiles that clearly missed the target.
So while we're talking about Ukraine's energy crisis due to Russia's very effective missile strikes on Ukraine, you have Ukraine getting American-made missiles and striking themselves. So a lot of people thought that Poland might have been intentional, might have been a false flag, right? The missile strike, I think that was November 15th, that hit a Polish, a very small town, killed a couple of people. It was from a Ukrainian S-300. We're not dealing with a great military here. Puppet governments don't generally wage intense military campaigns against a big power like Russia, and we're seeing the fallout of that. Ukraine is doing some absolutely just ridiculous things, including hitting its own residential infrastructure.
And landed again on a residential building. Anyway, around 70 missiles were involved. The Ukrainians, as I say, claimed that they shot down most of them. The reality seems to be that the majority of these missiles, the Russians like to claim all of them. How can one say one way or the other? But the majority of them do appear to have reached their targets. And according to Zelensky himself, something like 50% of the Ukraine's entire electricity output was down. Ukraine's nuclear power plants, those that are still under Ukrainian control, 3 of them, had to be disconnected from the Ukrainian electricity grid because of the extent of disruptions across the entire system. And as of the moment of speaking, the mayor of Kiev, Mr. Klitschko, says that 70% of Kiev is still without power. I've also heard reports that the whole of Kharkiv remains without power, and apparently other places across Ukraine have also been badly affected, though interestingly, Lviv in western Ukraine does appear to have its power back up again. And there's also reports that there's been major problems with the water system. There's been pictures of people in Kiev queuing to get fresh water. And there's also been severe problems with the railway system as well. The railway system seems to have been badly affected. And there's a report from one of the officials of the breakaway republics of the Donbass that the power outages across Ukraine apparently affected the movement and transportation of Ukrainian troops and supplies, and may be continuing to do so.
So we don't have to get too much more into this. I wanted to show you his summary of the effects of these strikes because, and thank you so much for the 1,000 viewers. Keep liking the video. We have 750 likes. Let's get that to 800. All right, but the damage there, the damage that Alexander Mercouris summarizes there, I think just shows how doomed Ukraine is here. And none of this had to happen. This did not have to be this way, but it had to be because the U.S. and the collective West wouldn't stop. And now this is a war that Russia sees as only ending once Ukraine's military is obliterated and once the Kiev regime basically says, we give up. White flag, white flag. But we know that the Ukraine government is very much okay with people suffering. So Alexander Mercouris didn't mention Kherson too, but when Russia withdrew from Kherson, it was already having its own problems with energy and in terms of power and resources. It was already depleted, and Ukraine has done nothing since taking over, quote unquote, temporarily to help that situation. So there are so many places in Ukraine now suffering, more than half, right? More than half of its power grid out. And it's affecting the military situation as well. And you can't but think that this is just one way in which Russia is going to win the electric war that Pepe Escobar talks about in his article, which we talked about in our stream together a couple days ago. We talked about how Russia understands that, you know, you need to fight in a way that will get real results. And Russia is now building up toward that end. And this campaign, which of course the EU has condemned, now calls Russia a terrorist state, a state sponsor of terrorism. It doesn't matter to Russia because this was a logical conclusion to basically suicidal policies on Ukraine's part, on the EU's part, and of course the United States sees all of this chaos as very beneficial to itself. But be careful what you wish for, because the civilian toll, this is very real. This is going to be a very difficult winter for Ukraine. There's going to be a lot of displacement. We already know that Russia has opened its doors to a lot of people in Ukraine saying, if you want citizenship here, we will give it to you because you are recognizing that this is an untenable situation and you support the right side. But there's going to be a lot of civilian costs to this. And Ukraine's economy was already in rough shape. It's about to get worse. The legitimacy of that government is about to be on its last legs, if it ever had any legitimacy. But I wanted to talk about, I'm going to read a report from RT on what Zelensky, or should we call Zelensky's wife. His wife made some very, what I would call crudely idiotic, reactionary, and just straight up, I don't even know what to say, just despicable comments about this situation. So as Russia has been targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, Zelensky's wife, her name being Elena, she says that they are ready to suffer. The people of Ukraine are ready to suffer. That's right. She is claiming that Ukrainians don't mind this because it's all for the great cause. She said freezing cold and electricity shortages are not the worst thing, quote unquote, she told the BBC. So Ukrainians are ready to withstand heating and power outages for years if the country is eventually allowed to join the EU, First Lady Elena Zelenskaya has claimed. She was interviewed by the BBC on Friday, yesterday. Speaking to the BBC after weeks of Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy facilities, Zelenskaya said that Ukrainians were, quote unquote, ready to endure a punishing winter if the country's bid for EU membership was successful. So, it's not, we'll see, but somehow I don't think it's going to be successful. President Vladimir Zelensky's wife cited a recent poll which found that more than 90% of Ukrainians would put up with power and heating shortages for 2 or 3 years if the country could become a member of the European bloc afterward. I would really love to know who's taking those polls. I'm sure it's not the vast majority of Ukraine citizens who are extremely poor. Extreme poverty is very high in Ukraine. It never really recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now it's only gotten worse. So I highly doubt that people of Ukraine in that situation are taking these polls. She said, we've had so many challenges, terrible challenges, seen so many victims, so much destructions, that blackouts are not the worst thing to happen to us. So one thing she doesn't understand is that, one, energy crisis leads to military crisis, and two, she doesn't care about poor people. She really does not. She's doing okay. Zelensky and the family, they're doing all right. Encouraged by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Ukraine applied for EU membership in February and was accepted as a candidate for accession in June. However, Kiev cannot join the bloc while engaged in armed conflict with its neighbor, and some member states have pointed out that the nation will have to root out corruption, clean up its human rights record, and strengthen the rule of law before it can be considered for membership. That's not going to happen. One thing, this is a permanent war, a proxy war that the United States wants to be engaged with, and the negotiations and negotiated settlement continues to be stymied. So on that point alone, but this puppet regime that was backed by some neo-fascist elements, right? Human rights concerns, corruption. Do you really think that's going to be cleaned up? This is one of the most corrupt governments in the world, right? So there's no EU membership on the way. It's a puppet government. They don't get EU membership. So as the temperature drops in Ukraine, Russia continues to strike targets of military significance across the country, including power plants and gas facilities. A large-scale missile attack on infrastructure objects were reported in Kiev, Kharkov, Odessa, Lviv, and other cities on Wednesday. So just 4 or 5 days ago. And this is going to continue. This is going to continue onward in this conflict. Russia has plenty of missiles, okay? It's not in the situation that NATO is in. NATO is running out of stockpiles. Russia is not. Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said on Thursday that 70% of Ukrainian capital was left without power following the strikes, while the CEO of Ukraine's largest private power utility called last week for citizens to consider leaving the country for winter to reduce the burden of the damaged grid. Russia has been targeting Ukraine's energy facilities since October 10th after accusing Kiev of terrorist attacks on Russian infrastructure, including the Crimean Bridge. The missile and drone campaign is focused on targets directly or indirectly to Ukraine's military potential, said Dmitry Peskov. So it's going to continue. It's been happening since October, and there was a massive escalation this week that really put Ukraine's energy situation in crisis. And that's going to continue. So the writing is on the wall. You know, we're definitely going to have Scott Ritter on. We'll probably have the Duran guys on. We'll probably have a lot of people back on here to give a more thorough analysis of this. But the writing is on the wall, right? You can get just from this information, just from these reports, that from Zelensky's wife herself, right, admitting that this is happening, that there are power outages, that there is an energy crisis. People are going to suffer, but it ain't so bad, says Vladimir Zelensky's wife. It isn't so bad. To me, there isn't anything more disgusting, right? It's like when U.S. politicians tell working people to just swallow the austerity, to just sacrifice for the good of the country, to just give more before you get more. Things will get worse before they get better. This is to an even higher degree so insulting to the people of Ukraine suffering under a conflict that doesn't have to be, never had to occur, didn't have to happen. But the U.S., NATO, its NATO lackeys, its EU lackeys made it happen, and they will continue to make it happen so long as they refuse to acknowledge not only Russia's position, but also the need to actually engage in diplomacy. And until they do that, this isn't going to end, because Russia has real strategic goals under these conditions. And those goals are just, they're non-negotiable unless the US side, unless the NATO side changes its position. They're non-negotiable, because how could you let Nord Stream, the Black Sea Fleet, Crimea? How could you let Donbass citizens and civilians get massacred like they have been? How could you let that happen? Vladimir Putin was in Donetsk recently, and he apologized to those fighters, those resistance fighters and their families, and said we should have done this earlier. I got a little choked up by that because I remember during the coup when there was a lot of people in Donbass, when there was the declaration of independence of these republics, and there was a lot of hope that Russia would come in, and Russia decided to go with the Minsk Accords, to go with a negotiated diplomatic settlement that would involve the powers who were ultimately instigating the situation. And Putin admitted that he was wrong, that wasn't the right way to go. And now there's a lot of time to make up. A lot of time to make up. All right. With that said, we're going to move on to our next story. We're moving right along, making really good time here. Be sure we have 1,000. We have almost 1,100 viewers. We have 859 likes. Let's get that up to 900. Can we do it? Can we get up to 900, guys? It would be amazing. It would be amazing. Thanks so much for the super chats. I'll go over them at the end. Maybe try to answer some questions. All right. But next is not everyone agrees with my politics. I'm a socialist. I am. I consider myself a true socialist, though, meaning I'm anti-empire to the core. And I also believe that working people must be at the center of everything that we're talking about. But we also have to understand geopolitics and how central it is to class warfare, right? So what's very interesting about this moment, right, is that we have a multipolar world, not just emerging, but developing, progressing, and getting stronger, right? I love having Pepe Escobar on here because he can break down BRICS Plus, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of these multilateral institutions being led by global South countries, led by Russia, by China, by Iran, all of these alliances, all of these pipelines, everything that's happening. There's a new world being built, and it's incredible, and it's very hopeful. Now, one thing that is very important to note, regardless of whether you agree with their leadership, them being Communist Party-led countries or not, it does so happen to be China, for example, but now you have Cuba as well, right? In Latin America, Cuba has always been a leader. You have to acknowledge that. It has been. Russia acknowledges that, and we're going to get into this. You have these countries playing a central role in the development of this new order of things, this new arrangement, this new set of social relationships that is set to liberate the world from empire. And I want to talk about Cuba's recent diplomatic exchanges because Cuba has had a very busy last couple of weeks. It was in Turkey, it was in Algeria, then Turkey, I believe, then Russia, and then China. I believe that was the order. But I want to talk about, because Algeria is very significant. They talked about canceling debts and increasing cooperation, and they have a very special relationship in the anti-colonial struggle. But I want to talk about Cuba's visits to Russia and China in particular, because I believe that these visits really do indicate the growth of this multipolar world, and also how socialism does play a big role in it. It's not the only role, but with China being probably the biggest force economically in this fight against unipolarity, against the empire, it's important to note that China goes by what it calls socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so that means it has a big role to play in shaping how the world relates to each other, how countries relate to each other. So first, Miguel Diaz-Canel and his top officials visited Russia first. And they did a beautiful thing. They unveiled, this is the anniversary of Fidel Castro's death as well. In 2016, he died around this time. And they unveiled a monument which cost something like $300,000 US dollars, not cheap. They unveiled a monument to Fidel Castro, as you see here, Vladimir Putin and Miguel Diaz-Canel. They attend a ceremony for the monument of late Cuban leader Fidel Castro in Moscow. So they vowed to strengthen bilateral ties. And here's CGTN's report. This report actually has a lot of good little facts in it that I think you need to be aware of, because it just shows also the progressive role that Russia is playing in the world, despite it no longer adopting a socialist model. And while, a lot of socialists have criticisms, right, of Russia's political model, it cannot be understated that Russia is a real friend to progressive nations around the world. And that means it is a progressive country. It does. Because while most countries are against the sanctions on Cuba, for example, not as many are as willing to do so much for Cuba like Russia. Really, I can only think of a few others. For example, China, who are willing. So anyway, let's get to some of these facts. It says Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Cuban counterpart Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez voiced common readiness on Tuesday to deepen relations between the two countries in the face of sanctions against both. Quote, the Soviet Union and Russia have always supported the Cuban people in their struggle for independence and sovereignty. We have always opposed any restrictions, embargoes, blockades, and so on. We have always backed Cuba on international platforms, Putin said in a meeting with Diaz-Canel at the Kremlin. Relying on the firm foundation of friendship, we must certainly move forward and enhance our cooperation in the current conditions, he told Diaz-Canel, who is paying an official visit to Russia from Saturday. So this was last week, and I think midweek was the last, and then he went to Beijing. Cuba appreciates Russia's effort and role in orienting the world toward multipolarity and wants to continue to promote relations with Russia, Diaz-Canel said. Before the talks, Putin and Diaz-Canel took part in the unveiling ceremony for the monument to Cuba's late leader Fidel Castro in Moscow. During the talks on Tuesday, the Russian parliament speaker Vyacheslav Volodin called Cuba, quote, a symbol of the struggle for independence, end quote, during talks on Tuesday, according to a readout published on the State Duma website. Diaz-Canel asserted that Russia can always count on Cuba and condemned sanctions against Moscow as coercive and unfair. So, just a little historical context. The Soviet Union was basically maybe the key reason why Cuba's socialist revolution was able to survive some of the harshest conditions of the Cold War. You had the Soviet Union provide immense energy resources in exchange for Cuba's sugar, but really it was a relationship where the Soviet Union saw Cuba as a friend, Cuba as a very trustworthy nation, and so Cuba really needed help in this way because of the U.S.'s blockade, and the Soviet Union provided it. And that relationship is continuing onward now under Vladimir Putin's leadership. So Russia, hit by Western sanctions over the conflict in Ukraine, is looking to strengthen political and economic ties with other countries opposed to what it calls U.S. hegemony. Cuba has been under a U.S. economic embargo since 1962 after the communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. Cuban state media reported that Diaz-Canel's agenda focuses on the energy sector, very sensitive for the island as it battles shortages of food, medicines, and fuel. Hours-long blackouts have occurred in Cuba's largest cities, sparking protests. The Cuban government has acknowledged the problem and accused U.S. sanctions, which were tightened under Trump, causing poverty and indirectly fueling the protests. So then there was Hurricane Ian, which also really did mess up a lot of infrastructure. And Cuba has urged Biden administration to ease sanctions that it says stifle recovery efforts. But estimates have showed that Russian oil has flooded into the island, providing relief. So this is important, providing relief to debilitating blackouts. So, as you know, the Biden administration has not done anything about the sanctions at all, right? It has continued Trump's policies. It has not done anything to move on continuing Obama's process of restoring some kind of relationship with Cuba. It hasn't done any of that. But Cuba has indeed gotten closer to Russia. And why wouldn't it, right? Here it says AP, the Associated Press reports that Russia has shipped an estimated $352 million in oil to Cuba since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the biggest inflow from Russia this century, and enough to cover about 40% of the shortfall in the island's supply. I mean, that's a huge deal, right? You could look at this as, and this is what Russia has done. Russia has moved on from the EU and said, we are going to work with countries that not only trust us, but that we can trust. And Cuba is one of them because they have this long history. They're in the Cold War, long history of supporting each other and supporting the existence of their societies in the face of aggressive maneuvers. So Cuba has faced harsh energy crises due to U.S. sanctions. So says a professor over in China, Mr. Or Miss Li Haidong. Canal's visit to Russia is helpful to maximize the transmission of Russian energy to Cuba and strengthen economic ties and communication between both countries. So there you have that. You have the visit to Russia, which is very significant. I mean, the monument is a very symbolic gesture. Russia is really saying that it is supporting countries that are also on a path to independence. Russia doesn't have to do that. I mean, in this situation, Russia indeed wants to seek out new markets to trade with. Of course. Why wouldn't it? But this goes beyond that because it wasn't the Russia-Ukraine conflict that got Russia and Putin into trading with Cuba. No, this has been going on for years and years, even before that. This has been an ongoing process. Russia, right? Of course, its shock therapy years are very dark years, and the Yeltsin years were very dark years. But nonetheless, the history shows that Russia and Cuba are actually far closer than they ever have been apart. And now they are both on the same course of building this multipolar world, regardless of whether they have different economic systems or not. I mean, this is a huge bridge that's being built because Cuba needs the energy and Russia needs allies. So this is a relationship that makes a lot of sense, and it's one that's going to infuriate official Washington, the neoconservative foreign policy blob. It's going to infuriate them because every action that the U.S. and the collective West take against Russia, against Cuba, has blowback effects. It has real effects on the U.S.'s own political position around the world. The U.S. is becoming more isolated. The collective West is not only unraveling, but also becoming more isolated. And countries like Russia and Cuba are becoming more and more of a they're getting more and more of a foothold, and they're getting stronger and stronger in their influence in world affairs. And that's a very good thing. So Cuba then went to Beijing. Miguel Diaz-Canel went to Beijing. And I want to just read a couple of reports on this. So let me pull up while you're waiting. Make sure you keep liking the video. Let's get back up to 1,000 viewers. We have 986 likes. Get up to 1,000, can we? Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. All right. Is this in Spanish? Oh, it's in Spanish. It was in English before. All right. I'm not going to read a Spanish article, but I can read the Chinese side. It was, I guess when I pulled back up, it went back to, I don't know how to translate it. All right. Let's go to the Chinese side, all right? Because they have also a report, which we can glean. And I want to say something that's significant about the Cuba-China relationship is that China had in its state media, it had this meeting at the top. It had this meeting on the front pages of all of its major websites. And its principal editorial in the Global Times was this meeting. So China is also placing a premium on this relationship. It is saying that this relationship is particularly important. It's particularly prominent. And here's what China has to say as the reasons why. Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Communist Party of China Central Committee and Chinese President, held talks with Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez, First Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba and Cuba's President, in the Great Hall of the People. Xi stressed that China and Cuba are good friends, good comrades, and good brothers who trust each other and share weal and woe. The three quote-unquote goods fully embody the special friendly relationship between the two parties and the two countries and are also the condensation and refinement of a special period of history. So this is how big China sees this. This is historical for China to be so close with Cuba. On this day, the two sides issued a joint statement of deepening Cuba relations in the new era, which speaks highly of traditional friendship between the two countries. On the basis of deepening political mutual trust and expanding practical cooperation, the two sides also emphasized firm mutual support on issues concerning each other's core interests and a consensus on the international order. This is a precious in today's international relations. So, not many people know, but Cuba was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And over the course of more than half a century, despite vicissitudes of the international situation, the sincere friendship and mutual cooperation between China and Cuba has not wavered and always shown vitality. Cuba relations with China have become a model of socialist countries to unite and cooperate, and for developing countries to sincerely assist each other. This is beyond the comprehension of narrow-minded U.S. and Western elites, beyond their comprehension. So, again, Cuba and China's relationship is incredibly important to not just the multipolar world, but China sees this as important to what it means for socialist countries to work together in solidarity, and for all developing countries, all oppressed countries, all countries that face the ire of Western and U.S. elites who don't get it. All of them can learn from this relationship. That's what China is saying. As is widely known, here we go. In fact, their opinion of Cuba-China relations is often low. When reporting on Diaz-Canel's visit to China, some U.S. media commented grotesquely that Cuba could be called China's quote-unquote brother in the U.S.'s backyard. This represents the inner thinking of a considerable number of Americans on China-Cuba relations. On the one hand, they regard Latin America as the U.S. backyard, a space that cannot be touched by outsiders. On the other hand, they twist the special relationship between China and Cuba and believe that because Cuba is geographically close to the U.S., it could be manipulated or used to create trouble for the U.S. If we follow this logic, it is easy to realize why Washington has become so enthusiastic about China's neighboring countries, which is true because the U.S. is interfering so much in Thailand and Malaysia and Myanmar. We can go on and on and on. The pivot to Asia, the militarization of the whole Asia Pacific, and not to mention the Taiwan situation. The U.S. is actually doing this, but now claiming that China and Cuba's relationship is an example of what the U.S. is doing. It's always projection with the American empire. It's always projection. And China is very clear that it doesn't recognize the Monroe Doctrine. It doesn't see Cuba as the U.S.'s backyard. It's going to trade with Cuba. It's going to cooperate with Cuba, and Cuba is going to cooperate with China as it sees fit. So all of this is just China saying, we don't recognize your imperialist hubris. As is widely known, the U.S. has imposed an embargo on Cuba for the last 60 years. This hatred and bullying against a sovereign country for such an extended period is something that could probably be only done by the U.S. So this article has some major jabs. The U.S. government argues that sanctions against Cuba only target the government, not the people, which is completely inconsistent with the facts. From fuel to food to daily necessities and medicines, U.S. sanctions and blockade against Cuba cover almost everything, causing large-term hardship for the Cuban people. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. even prevented Cuba from obtaining raw materials for vaccine production. This is no longer just a violation of international morality, but is tantamount to a crime. So China is sticking up for Cuba, and China is saying that only the U.S. could do this. So let's be clear here. China is right. China is right. Only the United States could do such a thing. Could you see Russia and China doing this to its neighbors 90 miles away? Would China ever to Australia, which is not 90 miles, but it's quite close, do something like this to Australia? Of course, a lot of harebrained Australians who are brainwashed by their imperialist government would say China's already doing this, but it's not. China is being sanctioned by Australia is going along with sanctions, economic warfare, and shooting itself in the foot. But China would never do this to its. I mean, it would be totally counterproductive. You know, China hasn't once put on. I mean, it's put on symbolic sanctions on the United States, but it's never responded to the trade war with tit for tat to hurt Americans, right? Because it would be counterproductive because it would hurt China. But nonetheless, only the U.S. could do what it's doing to Cuba. Only the U.S. Just earlier this month, the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly once again adopted a resolution with overwhelming majority of countries, 185 in favor, 2 against, and 2 abstentions, demanding that the U.S. end economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. So this is the 30th time that the UN General Assembly has passed similar resolutions with an overwhelming majority. The U.S. bullying against Cuba has triggered a broad sense in the international community of the need for justice. However, the U.S. has turned a deaf ear to these wide calls for justice, which is extremely insolent. So, yeah, the United States every single year at the UN General Assembly refuses to acknowledge that 185 countries out of 189, are opposed to the embargo. Precisely because of this special experience, Cuba has expressed its sincere agreement with China's proposals of humanity's common values, as well as the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. The value of the special friendship between China and Cuba has become increasingly prominent, especially in the context of the unprecedented expansion of Washington's desire for hegemony and the huge uncertainty the U.S. has caused. The U.S. nature of this experience is not only because the two sides have always adhered to the path of socialism with their own characteristics, but also because they share commonalities in safeguarding sovereignty and independence, defending international fairness and justice, and promoting world peace and development. They are connected at the heart. Cuba and China are connected at the heart. This is what multipolarity is. This is what cooperation and solidarity is. This is what it means for two socialist countries to work together. China-Cuba cooperation is a microcosm of China-Latin America cooperation. Cuba plays a critical role in the political ecology of Latin America, which highlights the strong desire of Latin America to follow the path of independent development. China-Cuba cooperation and China-Latin America cooperation have grown in leaps and bounds in recent years. In addition to the objective factor of economic complementarity, it is also due to the fact that they are both developing countries that can better appreciate the value of mutual respect and win-win cooperation. Some U.S. media were sarcastic about the Cuban head of state visit, claiming that China is using Cuba to gain geopolitical benefits. This reflects Washington's habitual hegemonic thinking about Latin America. So it's always projection again. It's always China's trying to do geopolitics. China is offering real cooperation. So Cuba is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It signed up in December of 2021, and its focus is a lot on energy, but it's also focused on all kinds of infrastructure. And this was a choice by the Cuban government. It wasn't China forcing it on the Cuban government. Countries in Latin America really respect China because China doesn't do what the U.S. does. The U.S. says that Latin America is its backyard. The U.S. says it's its front yard. The U.S. never treats Latin America like an equal. It never treats the Caribbean like an equal. China, on the other hand, will say, hey, we have telecommunications technology. We have public infrastructure, high quality technology, high tech. We have all of these things. We can help you build these things as well. We can also come to your aid when it comes to COVID-19 or when it comes to these sanctions. We can give you medical supplies. We can help you in that way. And we're not going to put sanctions on you. We're not going to act like the United States. And that is very, very, very important to Latin America. And that's why the majority of countries in that region, if not all of them, really value the relationship they have with China. So during his talks with Diaz-Canel, President Xi said, quote, China's commitment to long-term friendship with Cuba will not change. China's determination to support Cuba and pursuing socialism will not change. China's will work with Cuba to safeguard international fairness and justice, oppose hegemony and power politics, and that will not change. Friendship, justice, and mutual assistance. This is the overall pattern of Cuba-China relations in the new era, and it is also China's consistent attitude in foreign exchanges. So after Diaz-Canel's trip, Mongolia's president will come, and then the General Secretary of Lao People's Revolutionary Party Central Committee will come, and the Lao president will come to China successfully right after. And then this is the one here. China's circle of friends is stable and close and constantly expanding. That's what multipolarity is. China is an attractive market. You're not gonna be able to refute that. There's a lot of people who disagree with China's politics, with its economic model, with its COVID response. There's a lot of anti-China propaganda out there. There's been a lot of brainwashing out there. But let me just say this. China is playing a very progressive role in the world, and it is coming to Cuba's aid when it comes to these sanctions. And it also is providing this model. Think about this. China is making a statement. China has not only defended Russia It stayed neutral, but still defended Russia, has asserted Russia's position on numerous occasions, refuses to break off ties with Russia. It's actually strengthened its ties with Russia since the Ukraine war. These two countries have a strategic alliance that is the most important in the world at this point. Not only this, but China has made a huge statement with regard to multipolarity, in that China sees multipolarity as emphasizing the future benefit of all developing countries, with an emphasis on socialist countries. Not that China is saying socialist countries are better than others. What it's saying is that it is going to build friendships based on commonalities, and the more commonalities, then the more friendship. There's not going to be conditionality on friendship, but there is going to be an emphasis on what it really means to be good friends around the world, and what it means to develop in a way that benefits all. Win-win cooperation is what China says. And so this is why, after the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, who was the first to visit China? It was the Central Committee, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam's Central Committee, that came to visit Beijing. Now Miguel Diaz-Canel is the second. So it's two socialist countries. Now you have Laos leaders who are going to come and visit. China is making a statement. China is making a statement saying that multipolarity, international solidarity is contingent on real friendship, and people are coming after this National CPC Congress, the 20th CPC Congress, which charts the way forward over the next 5 years. It's saying that these countries are going to be a huge part of that, because China sees itself as socialist, as independent, as sovereign, and it sees itself as a critical leader that leads by example, that leads this multipolar world order that's developing by example, not by force, but through cooperation. And so there was a host of documents signed for Belt and Road Initiative cooperation with Cuba in all areas of infrastructure, medical, transportation, energy, all of it. All of it is on the table. Cuba and China's friendship is growing, and the multipolar world is only becoming stronger. And I find this time, where I covered the the trip that Vietnam's leadership took to China, but this timeline, right, that China in these events that are transpiring with regard to China is very big, because China is really the future of the world economy, the future of global development. And China is making a huge statement in this moment of chaos that it is stable, its economy is stable, its political situation is stable, and it is going to act as a force for peace in the world, not of war, like the United States and the collective West. And that's why we need to keep watching out for when things like this happen. It's a big deal. It really is a big deal. So, all right. That's it for the formal content here. We went through that fast. I was talking pretty fast. I didn't want to go into the 2-hour mark with the content, because I'd like to stay on with you for a little longer, hanging out, super chat questions, that kind of thing. I'll try to find some Patreon questions. I don't know if anyone submitted for tonight, but I had some left over from the last stream. With that said, though, keep liking this video. We've already reached 1,000 likes. We're about 963 viewers. Some people probably had to go to bed or something like that. But keep sharing it. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Hit that notifications bell. And as I said before, I am completely independent. I am about $50 per month, not too much away from reaching a goal of mine that would help keep me sustainable month by month. Because what happens on all of these platforms is that we lose subscribers due to economic situations, etc. Sometimes they just take us off. I've had Patreon subscribers just be taken off of the rolls, which is super annoying, as you can imagine. So, subscribe there, subscribe on Substack. You can subscribe on the channel. I have a dedicated growing group of channel members who are very supportive. So you can join there as well. You can find that on the YouTube channel. You can tip me on Rockfin, because I am streaming on Rockfin right now. Rockfin.com / the left lens. You can tip on Rockfin. But yeah, let me thank the super chats now as we wind down. All right. There was quite a few in the beginning. I don't know. I wasn't really looking at the chat while I was talking during this last segment. But let me see what's going on here. All right. Oh, I got a big super chat who just came in. Say thank you to you. Thanks, Notary S, for the generous super chat or super sticker. I don't know which. I think it was a super chat. Let me see. Here we go. Mech Stalin said, at the beginning of the war, Russia was easily encircling Ukraine forces and destroying most of their Soviet weapons. Now, Russia's reinforcing while Ukraine was wasting its NATO weapons. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Ukraine blew through NATO's arsenal, blew through it. I mean, just, it was just a, it was just a hot mess. I don't know how else to describe it. It's a hot mess. It's like if you're just, it just reminds me of the jokes, seeing in movies where people don't know how to use weapons. They just fire them and they're going everywhere, and they've never held the gun before and they're just firing it. That's what this war has felt like for me, or at least this conflict has felt like for me. That's Ukraine, right? Just getting weapons and just firing away, right? Firing away. Going on these offensives with no potential for long-term victory. It was just short-term gains. I mean, I look at it this way. The country is divided. Most people in the Donbass don't want to be part of Ukraine. What victory is it to blow through weapons, make short-term gains in your own country, only to dive into a future of hopelessness? It's not a victory. This is a victory only in the minds of narrow, selfish, and arrogant imperialists. It's a victory only for them, because they get to make super profits off the military-industrial complex. They get to make super profits off of the energy crisis. They get to artificially inflate the dollar. You know what I'm saying? Like that. That's who wins here. Now the EU is saying this, but of course the EU is not going to do nothing about it in reality. What are they going to do about it? What leverage does the EU have at this point? But nonetheless, that's what Ukraine has felt like for me. Is it's felt like, how could anyone have talked about victory when it comes to Ukraine? There was no victory coming for Ukraine. Ukraine was at war with itself. People didn't want to be part of Ukraine. Who wants to be part of a coup regime? This is not rocket science. This is not it's not unprecedented either. It is in this part of the world, I guess, in recent history, but not really. Not really. Why has everyone forgotten Libya in slave markets? I mentioned it right after you put it in. Thank you so much for triggering my memory, Laima. Thanks for coming back too. I think I recognize you. So thanks for that super chat. Is there anything else coming in? And here we go. We had Chung Ling Tong. Thank you so much for your super sticker. Here we go. Alex Puglisi. Thoughts on Tsai Ing-wen stepping down as head of DPP after getting wrecked by the KMT in local elections? Wow. I was so busy. I didn't even see this story. So thank you for triggering. I should have covered this. Shoot. Maybe I'll cover it in the next one. Wow. So this is good. This is very good news. I'm seeing this now online. Thanks for the super chat. My thoughts are, thank you. Tsai Ing-wen is a puppet's puppet. Like, she is the most, just like, she just drools over the American empire, kneels before them. And I am glad to see the KMT make gains, because the KMT, for all of its flaws in history, the KMT in its current iteration over the last several years, decades, you could say, has been the most fervent, is the strongest party of the status quo. So in that regard, I firmly support the KMT's victorious elections, not because I like agree with everything the KMT believes, but if there's one thing that's most important that I do agree with, it's the status quo. It's the one China policy. Even if the KMT thinks they should be governing all of China, they also understand that relations with mainland China and being part of China diplomatically, economically, and all of that is very important. So that's very good news. Very good news. Thanks so much for tipping that. I was very busy getting ready for this stream, so I'm so glad to hear that breaking news. I see BBC has covered it. I won't cover it here as a segment, but it does say that she's resigned as head of the governing DPP party after poor showing in local elections. This is great, because this is going to really hurt the independence, quote unquote, independence movement. It will. It really will. I see another super chat has come in, but I'm gonna let's see. Mech Stalin, I think you already gave one, but you said, "What's up with the protests in China? Why hasn't the Communist Party stepped in to protect the workers at Foxconn?" So this is a really fast growing situation. The government has stepped in with the company, and from what I'm hearing, that there's going to be strict regulations. Regulations in China is different from regulations in the United States. It's not like this huge, laborious, we have to pass legislation and it has to go through all of this, and it may not happen in months and months, maybe ever. It's going to happen like Chinese government leadership is going to come in. It's already been speaking to the company to rectify these issues. Now, if these issues aren't rectified, I'm sure punishment will get steeper and steeper. But Foxconn has a very contradictory role in China. This has to be said. It's a Taiwan based, or at least origins in Taiwan. It's China, though. It's a Chinese company known in the mainland as very exploitative. But at the same time, you can make a lot of money working for Foxconn. And the government is trying so hard to keep government protections and regulations for workers up there, from the canteening, from the residency to the protections around wages, labor law, all of that. But it's been very difficult and not always successful. And local government doesn't always help, because that's where a lot of the corruption resides. And that's where China has placed a lot of its focus on anti-corruption. So with that said, yeah, these protests, I've been seeing them. I'm trying to keep a bit of caution in trying to research the situation before I make full comments on it, because there are labor organizations, anti-China, NED-backed labor organizations like the China Labor Bulletin, these kind of groups that do get involved in these things. And I'm very suspicious of that activity. And when I see that there's not a lot of reporting from the Chinese side, I think that there's also a lot of caution about the domestic situation. And so I am kind of waiting and seeing to see how things develop. But also there was the tragedy in Xinjiang, in Willamuchi, the capital of Xinjiang, the fire that has also sparked protests in Shanghai. It's unclear what the character of those protests are, but it is clear that there are tensions in China, because on the one hand, China's been able to do some amazing things, but on the other, it's a very difficult international situation. Pandemic policy has gone through a lot of changes. And while this is a strength, I think, of the Chinese side and their economy and their political system, it can also be very difficult and challenging. So on the one hand, while change is very good, and it means that the government can respond to people's needs, it also means change is also very difficult as well. And so some changes to the pandemic policy have not always gone well. And while Willamuchi and Xinjiang has a pretty stellar pandemic record and no real issues before this, that fire has definitely placed its COVID-19 response on, under somewhat of a microscope, although it might be unfair, and it might be more so that there are other issues that China still has to resolve, which led to things like what happened with the fire. And I think several people did die. So there's going to be consequences for that too. So, the government has stepped in. whether, it's hard to know, like, will we see the changes? Because they won't be reported on by the Western corporate media. Will we see the reforms? Because, from my understanding, is that this has been a long-standing battle between the government and Foxconn. The Chinese government has done its best to ensure that Foxconn is regulated. Now you have Communist Party members going into workplaces, having a real presence. But, Foxconn is a major company. It builds all of the Apple products, and it's one that China really needs to continue to help fuel its growth. So this contradiction will continue, but thanks so much for the super chat there. And I know there's one on the bottom, but let me see if there's any more at the top. We got some more super chats coming in. Thanks so much. Here's a member. But Janine, thank you. If I passed over any members, I am sorry. Thank you for the kind words. And thank you for being a channel member, Janine. You are one of the best authentic lawyers. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Really warms my heart. Really warms my heart that so many people are here on this stream tonight, and that these streams are growing, man. These streams are really growing. You all are helping. So hit that notifications bell. Come back to all of these streams. You're never going to be disappointed, I hope. And if you are, tell me. And surely we can I can learn too. I am not one to to know it all. Thank you, GB, for that super chat. And search Ukraine Reverend on YouTube. Look at the comments. Okay. Thank you for the super chat, Dark Dragonov. I'll have to do that afterwards. I don't know what I'm going to be looking at. Bigfoot says, hi, Dan. Let's talk about the Foxconn situation, how Taiwanese companies discriminate against mainland workers in mainland, causing the latest riots. Yeah, mainland, when I was there, and anyone would, people would just, people know in China that this is a blight. There's a reason why Foxconn is like the one that you hear about. It's because it's the one that causes the most trouble. It has special privileges. It's very delicate with the Taiwan mainland situation. China wants mainland and Taiwan trade to increase, to get better. It also wants the relationship with Western capital to a degree. It wants to be part of that supply chain. But there are consequences, and the consequences are that this company is not one that's dedicated to socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so China has had a hard time with enforcing the regulatory measures, with getting things under control. But to be fair, I think also Foxconn conditions have gotten better, right? They've gotten better over the years. And this contradiction I always bring up is factories in China, production in China, while it has low relative wages comparatively to maybe to other companies around the world, in China, because of the exchange rate, because of the standard of living, because people, can get overtime, they live in the countryside still, whatever the situation may be, they can make a lot of money, and that presents some problems, right? And that's always going to be the case with market reform. And that's why China is trying to ease those contradictions, has done a really good job doing that. But the struggle continues. The struggle definitely does continue. Definitely. So I think that's the end of the super chats for tonight. It's about 10:30 p.m. out here in the United States where I am residing. Yeah, it's interesting. China's not a perfect country. It can't be. I always say that if you want China's socialism or any system independent of U.S. imperialism to be perfect, right? To meet all of your check boxes, right? Whether it's human rights, LGBTQ stuff like Russia, for example. If you want China to have a completely equal society, well, then our job out here in the West is to give China, give Russia, give all these countries the actual chance to resolve their own contradictions without having to put so much undue weight on external forces. And I say this because how many times have you heard you can't blame everything on America? You blame everything on the CIA, on the American empire, on imperialism. Let's be honest. If countries did not have to deal with that, with the military bases, with the sanctions, with the invasions, with the interference, with the intelligence operations, with all of it, the bribing, the political bribery, the all of the things that go down in politics when the empire is trying to assert its hegemony. If these countries didn't have to do that, then yeah, maybe this process would accelerate. Maybe instead of eliminating extreme poverty, China would have eliminated all poverty by now, right? Without having to deal with how does it relate to this hegemon in the world, on the world stage, which is hell bent on overthrowing China's government, which it has been since 1949. That goal never changed just because the relationship got better. It didn't change. There's a reason why the CIA was hacking in to China's aviation industry, China's energy industry, China's tech industry. There's a reason why it's tried to do that. Why WikiLeaks was able to find out. Was it WikiLeaks? No, it was WikiLeaks. It was a China a cyber security firm, Chihu 360, which found through WikiLeaks documents that this was the case, right? So, I mean, there's a reason for that. And the reason is because China has to deal with the empire, just like Russia has to deal with the empire, just like Cuba has to deal with the empire. So there will be contradictions and there will be problems, right? I'm getting a lot of people I know living in China are not happy with the COVID restrictions still. And that's, I would get it. I'm a Westerner myself. I live in the United States. I surely would have a hard time with the zero COVID policy. But I have a hard time with the non-zero COVID policy in the United States. It's super confusing sometimes. You don't know what to do. No one's doing anything. Everything's normal, but not normal, right? It's very confusing and stressful and annoying. And, everyone's mental health is shot to hell. But I get it. It's frustrating to be under zero COVID this whole time. I get it. That's not fun. That's, but at the same time, it's difficult to do everything exactly right, exactly how you want it done. And so China's navigating storms. Xi Jinping said that. It's navigating headwinds. And so there's going to be contradictions and there will be problems. So Daniel Hill, thanks so much for this generous super chat. Said, hey, Danny, can you please spend a minute to explain the Uyghur situation? Aussie mainstream media has weaponized for propaganda purposes. Thank you. Thanks, mate. I can't do an Aussie accent, so I will just imagine what that sounded like. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. The Uyghurs, huh? The Uyghurs. Okay. I watched this guy, Skip Bayless. He's a sports commentator, and he does that breathing. I also follow some impressionists, hilarious, who copies him, and he does this sigh. But so the Uyghurs. All right, here we go. We're on the Uyghurs now. Oh yeah, let me just give you my best summary of the Uyghur situation. Maybe we can close out on this, unless you have some other super chat questions. I'm also going to look for other one. If there's one other question, let me see. Yeah, so I think I might have answered all of them. All right, so I answered all the Patreon questions. So I'll just get to this one. The Uyghurs. So, the Uyghur population is growing. They're one of the 56 ethnic groups in China. They're the majority. So anytime you see like Uyghur Autonomous Region, Tibet Autonomous Region, whenever you see those words, it means that population, that ethnic group is the majority, or the most populous, right? The plurality. It's the most populous out of the rest of the population. And so the United States has weaponized Australia to the entire collective West, has targeted this issue, has said that China is committing, first, it was in 2017. I don't know if you remember. It began under Trump with the concentration camps narrative. And that was peddled by the Chinese network of human rights defenders and other NED-backed think tanks, and figures like Adrian Zenz, the far-right Christian fundamentalist who works for the victims of Memorial Communism Foundation, the Victims of Communism Foundation. He's a far-right, basically fascist. He's an evangelical, who believes in the rapture, and he believes he's ordained by God to take down the Communist Party of China. So he jumped on this statistic from 8 interviews from the network of Chinese human rights defenders that said that there's 1 million people in concentration camps, maybe 2 million. Then that narrative got debunked. Place like the Gray Zone, I've done it on this channel, looking at these NED sources saying, this is very suspicious, not just suspicious, but damning. It shows that this is a U.S. government narrative, that this narrative is being peddled by the U.S. to undermine China. And so that narrative changed to genocide, right? It was now what's happening in these camps is genocide. 1 to 2 million people are in these camps, and there's a genocide taking place. They're being sterilized. Adrian Zenz was once again the principal source, but you had some new kind of think tanks come out, like the New Line Institute, the World Uyghur Congress, for example. All of them are National Endowment for Democracy, CIA cutouts that are just perpetuating this narrative, that are holding on to the narrative of a very select few Uyghur Uyghur exile community forces living in places like Turkey, Kazakhstan. These forces have been used as basically operatives of a U.S. propaganda psychological operation. Likely, people say CIA, but it's really the U.S. intelligence agencies working through their Color Revolution foundations, right? The National Endowment for Democracy. So these narratives have been bandied about, right? They've been bandied about, constantly recycled. Then it was cultural genocide right after that, right? 2019, 20, 21. No, they couldn't prove because the numbers are damning. The Uyghur population has increased like 25% since 2012, I believe it was. Uyghur life expectancy is very close now to Han, the majority, Chinese, and the rest of the population. So a very strange genocide for people's lives to get better, right? It's a very strange genocide. It doesn't usually happen. Usually genocides make people's lives worse. And then the cultural genocide myth came about. You even had Radio Free Asia saying, oh, China is suppressing Muslims, and then videotaping in Kashgar Muslims celebrating Eid, saying that China was forcing them to dance. This is how ridiculous the narrative became and still is. The fact of the matter is that there is more than 10,000 mosques in Xinjiang alone, and China is maybe the single country with the most mosques in the world. So they try to say cultural genocide, taking away the mosques, all of this, they're not practicing Islam, when there's verifiable evidence that I was there. I've been to Willamuchi. I've been to that region. People practice Islam. People are not being culturally genocided or any other kind of genocide. People are living normal lives. People have, they have their desires, their needs, and their wants. They have critiques of the government. They have love for the government, just like any other society, right? Where you have diversity of thought, diversity of existence. But most people on the whole are very appreciative that their lives are better than they were 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago. Remember, Xinjiang was one of the last regions to come out of extreme poverty. And that's been a project. They were a portion of that 99 million in 2012 that were left over. And China, right, in its government, the CPC, and people of that region came together to fight that and to eradicate it. And I saw the fruits of that. You see a lot of modern infrastructure there. It's really easy to get around now. Business is flourishing. Tourism there is absolutely incredible. Domestic tourism is incredible there. That region is rising. And so there was a lot of terrorist activity. That's what's never talked about. There was violent insurgent forces that were being backed by the West. There's evidence of this. The CIA and others helped back these forces in the 80s and the 90s during all those other interference campaigns on the border of China's Xinjiang region. There was support coming in for these forces, and they became armed. They became extremists. They became these jihadists that you hear about, like in Syria. They actually went to fight in Syria, right? The AP and all Reuters and all these Western media outlets, they were saying that these groups were a problem in committing violence in China all the way up until 2016. They were. Now it's not recognized. It's not recognized as such. You know why? Because the attacks stopped. And do you know why the attacks stopped? The attacks stopped because China conducted a real policy of de-radicalization, not imprisoning people, torturing them at Guantanamo, not dropping bombs on the countries maybe where they are being armed or they're fighting or whatever. I mean, not with repression, even though there was violence and there had to be some repression when you have people being stabbed. In Welamuchi, for example, happened a couple of times. Happened hundreds of times over a span of a decade or so. Or 2 decades, in 1990 to 2016, 2.5 decades, you had hundreds of attacks. But they did it with education. They did it with employment. And those are the camps they're talking about, the vocational education training centers, the VOTCs, they call them, or VOE, VOETs, whatever. They're called educational and vocational training centers, and they have been targeted as the camps. But it worked. The attacks have stopped. Standards of living have risen. People have reintegrated into society. They did what the U.S. prison system says it does, but actually never does, which is rehabilitate, help people get away from this very anti-human ideology, because it is. It's not all of Islam. It's this particular strand, just like every religion has this, evangelicals, right? You have it everywhere. You have these strands of religion that are weaponized to serve anti-human ends because they are an outgrowth of the anti-human political economy, right? That's what terrorism is in that region, an anti-human political economy that came from external forces, imperialist ravaging, right? Since the early 70s. I mean, late 70s, Afghanistan. So China addressed that in a very particular way. The attacks stopped, and then suddenly this narrative sprung out because a new Cold War was launched, and also this stability was a threat. It was a threat. And so this propaganda war continues. It's not the last we're probably going to hear about this. Probably going to hear more about it. But just know that Uyghurs' lives are getting better. China's situation with this instability and this extremism has gotten a lot better. Stability is really what the U.S. is threatened by. And the U.S. really wants to cut off China from its main Belt and Road link. It's made road link out of China because that's what Xinjiang is. It's a huge region in Western China. That's what the United States wants out of Xinjiang. There's a lot of natural resources there too, yeah, but it really is about the Belt and Road Initiative, cutting that off at its at a main corridor. It's not going to work. The pipelines will continue to be built. The integration of China with the rest of Central Asia, with the rest of Asia, and beyond will continue. But the propaganda will also continue so long as the United States is able to wage this humanitarian interventionist line of thinking to serve its warmongering ends. That's really the Uyghur situation in a nutshell. Oh, we're getting up to 2 hours now. All right. So I got a couple more super chats. I think I saw Julie Anderson. Please don't downplay people's concern about Uyghurs. Where there's smoke, just don't dismiss our concerns. Yeah, I mean, look, it's not for me. It's not about dismissing concerns. Thanks so much for the super chat. It's not about whether I think it's okay when you hear about oppression. And when you hear about something like Muslims, for example, anywhere in the world being oppressed, it's okay to be concerned because this is something that happens a lot. However, it's also important to do the research to like understand if these sources are legitimate. And if none of the sources of this are legitimate, which I don't think they are, right? I don't think any of those who are actually peddling this as verifiable truth without any evidence, they're not, to me, they're not to be trusted. You know, they have a political agenda, which is all about propaganda. It's all about lies, right? It's all about weapons of mass destruction, lies, kind of lies. So if that's the case, then we have to say, well, what is the actual situation? Surely Uyghurs, just like all ethnic groups in China, have problems. I don't think that they're ethnically based necessarily, though. I actually don't think China has that kind of problem. I think China has an underdevelopment problem, and that underdevelopment is regional. And that means that there are certain contradictions that exist in some places that don't in others in China. So certainly that's a problem, and that will cause a lot of tensions, and that will cause issues. And I'm not saying that people have zero issues in Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region. There are plenty. It's still pretty underdeveloped. It's still pretty poor, although it's a lot better than it used to be. But I think, nonetheless, we have to ask ourselves, are Uyghur Muslims in China being oppressed on the basis of being Uyghur and being Muslim? Or the answer is no. The answer is no. They're not. They're practicing their religion. They have improved standards of living. Um, there's a reason why, despite all of China's insistence that the United States these sources come to China and see for themselves. There's a reason why, while some have done it, most have not, and that's because they don't want the burden of they don't want the burden of having to actually explain their position with facts. They don't want that. So, Mex Stalin, thank you again for another super chat. America spread far-right ideas to combat communism. Why are people claiming NATO is spreading woke ideas like America care less about LGBT rights in Russia as long as they get cheap resources? Yeah. Yeah, it's true. No, there's no wokeness in NATO. I mean, this whole, it's all about the law in Russia, the LGBT law. Yeah, Russia has its own particular conditions. Well, surely, like, I will defend the rights of LGBT people, LGBTQ plus everyone, people. I'll defend those all, that's like not even, for me, that's just a given, right? With the shooting and all of that that's happened. I have clients, I do therapy part-time. I have clients who are struggling with all that's happening. Like I'm not gonna sit here and say, oh, it's all a conspiracy, the woke conspiracy. But I will say that Russia does have legitimate gripes because the US has weaponized this. And I feel like that is, to me, even more insulting than any legislation that Russia could pass, is how the United States, through its NGOs, will weaponize an issue like LGBTQ plus rights for the purposes of waging war. And I feel like that just undermines everything. You can't have a legitimate conversation. There is nothing more socially reactionary than war, right? So, like, there's just no moral high ground that they can stand on with this issue, and I just find it despicable that that it's been wielded in this way, and that Russia, I don't know much about this law. I know it's not even on the books yet. It's still being talked about, but at this point, when there's a literal war going on against Russia, I say that Russian people need to decide what's going on in Russia for themselves. And that will be my position until we have a real relationship with Russia as people to people relationship, where we can really learn from each other as equals. And that means a lot of work to be done in the United States to stop causing all these problems, right? All right. I think I blew through those super chats. All right, everyone. It's getting late out here. I'm actually running out of laptop battery. All plug that in. All right, guys. So the agenda for me. First, continue to subscribe, hit that notifications bell. I got a good like ratio. I'm not going to keep begging for those likes. I got 1.3 now. It says 1,000. Thank you so much for everyone who came. Tomorrow, no stream. Maybe Monday. That would be late. Trying to work that out. That would be probably after 9:15. Late. That's the earliest I could do because I have an appointment. Let's see. Oh, we got some trolls on the chat, huh? I laugh at trolls. I think it's funny that people, I've never been, it's funny. I've had times where internet stuff affected me in the past, but I don't know what it is. I think it's maybe when I turned 30 or something, when I got into my 30s, I was like, this stuff is ridiculous. Who cares? When I first started writing, I would get all these nasty emails, some of which were kind of creepy because you know how it is online in email. I mean, email world is like it's like a spam central. So you get these creepy ones too. But no, the internet stuff just doesn't bother me. So I find if trolls are funny. So yeah, next stream probably Monday. So hit that notifications bell. Or Tuesday, if I can get. Depends if my wife calls in sick that night. I don't know if she is. If she does, it's likely no. Tuesday would definitely be a definite. So yeah, I've not heard back from Claire Daly yet to confirm. We are set because it was agreed upon, and now I'm just trying to get confirmation and stuff. Hopefully that'll happen on Friday. Nonetheless, though, keep hitting that notifications bell. And also support this work. Patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. It's the best way. This is completely independent media. I think I had some subscribers actually come on during this stream. Oh no, I had no new ones yet, but I had some people increase. Thank you so much. I also do things like I have someone who's asking me for writing help, who's asking me for resources. That stuff takes time, and I like to build like a committed relationship. So that's going to happen. I asked for increased pledges or something of the sort, especially for the extra labor. But I do stuff like that too. So I'm not like I'm trying to help people as well. I just now hope that my time will be compensated, unlike the past. Someone actually asked me for resources on socialism, and it just reminded me of how I've written like hundreds of articles, right? And for like no money. And I didn't expect any money because I was like, I'm in the movement. I'm in a movement. This is my contribution. But now that, it kind of costs money to do this work, the labor time, like, all right, some kind of compensation. So that's why I'm like, all right, I'll rely on the people that read me. And it's great because I'm independent, but it's a gig model too. And I get people have their struggles. So support me on Patreon. Help me get there. I'm about $42, I think, per month. So I say per month, so not too far away. I would love to reach that before December 1st, but I get it. I wish I took rubles and URMB. I wish we had a currency situation like that. I've had people in China on WeChat be like, I want to support you, but I need to pay you on WeChat. And then the United States doesn't really allow that stuff because I have a US bank, and it's the regulations are too strict. I get it though. All right, everyone. Take good care. I'm going to leave. Good night. Great talking to you. And see you all again very soon. A couple days probably. All right. Monday, Tuesday. See you.